"You're in my seat." The voice sliced through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "And frankly, I'm not sure how you even wandered into this section of the plane. The economy cabin is in the back." The words were designed to be a cannonball, to shatter the calm and assert dominance through sheer, unadulterated arrogance. The man who spoke them, Sterling Thorne, believed he was simply swatting away an inconvenient fly. He was a titan of industry, a man whose net worth was a rounding error in the GDP of a small nation, and his platinum-encrusted frequent flyer card was, in his mind, a royal scepter. He was accustomed to a world that bent to his will. He was, therefore, completely unprepared for the reality that he had just aimed his cannon at a fortress. The woman he was addressing didn't even flinch. She didn't look up from the dense technical schematic she was reviewing on her tablet. He saw a black woman, perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue travel suit. He saw an obstacle. He did not see Dr. Imani Hayes, the newly confirmed chairwoman of the National Transportation Safety Board. He did not see the woman whose signature could ground his entire fleet of recently acquired, cost-shaved-to-the-bone aircraft. He did not see the architect of his own impending ruin. This is the story of what happens when a man who believes money is the ultimate power confronts a woman who wields the power of absolute, unassailable fact. It is the story of a reckoning at 35,000 feet, where the only currency that truly matters is the truth. The cabin of Ascend Air Flight 305 from Washington Dulles to San Francisco was a study in beige minimalism. It was Sterling Thorne's latest acquisition, a struggling regional airline he was gutting and rebranding as a low-cost carrier with premium aspirations. The leather on the seats felt thin, the complimentary champagne tasted vaguely of vinegar, and the smiles of the flight attendants were stretched tight with anxiety. Outside the windows, a persistent Virginia drizzle wept down the plexiglass. Imani Hayes had chosen this flight for a reason. She never flew private. It was a core principle. To understand the system, you had to be in the system. You had to feel its vibrations, listen to its groans, and see the cracks that only appeared under pressure. Her confirmation hearing had been a brutal partisan affair, but she had prevailed. For the last 72 hours, she had been the final authority on transportation accidents in the United States. Her job wasn't to regulate, it was to investigate disasters. Her mission was to find the flaw, the broken link in the chain, the single overlooked detail that led to tragedy, and ensure it never happened again. She was, in essence, a professional prophet of the past, tasked with saving the future. She had been in D.C. for the final vote and was now flying home to brief her senior investigators in San Francisco on a new initiative. The airline, Ascend Air, was already on her agency's watch list. Their incident reports, while minor so far, showed a troubling pattern: delayed maintenance, overworked crews, and a corporate culture that prioritized on-time departures over rigorous safety checks. Flying on one of their planes was not a perk, it was reconnaissance. She took a slow sip of her bottled water, her eyes scanning the digital blueprint of a Boeing 737's hydraulic actuator assembly. She had a photographic memory for engineering designs, a skill honed during her doctorate at Caltech, and her subsequent years as a systems failure analyst. She noticed a faint, almost imperceptible tremor as the plane taxied away from the gate, a low-frequency shudder that wasn't consistent with normal runway vibration. She made a small note on her tablet with a stylus. Check N734AA's landing gear maintenance logs, possible hydraulic pressure variance. It was then that the carefully constructed piece of the cabin was violated. "I'm sorry, sir, but your boarding pass is for seat 2B, a young flight attendant named Chloe said, her voice wavering. She couldn't have been more than 22, and her face was pale with nervous apprehension. "Don't tell me what my boarding pass says. Tell your system what it should say," the man boomed. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a perpetually tanned forehead. His suit was a shimmering grey sharkskin that probably cost more than Chloe's annual salary. Sterling Thorne. Imani knew him by reputation. A corporate raider who bought companies, stripped them for parts, and left the husks to rot. He was the new owner of this very airline. He stomped down the aisle and stopped, looming over Imani's seat, 1A. He pointed a thick, manicured finger at her. "This is my seat. I always sit in 1A. It has the primary power outlet I need to close a $10 million deal before we land. Your hobby can wait." He gestured dismissively at her tablet. Imani slowly raised her head. She met his gaze with an expression of mild, scientific curiosity. She had seen this type of man before in boardrooms and congressional hearings. They operated on the principle that volume and intimidation were substitutes for merit. "I'm afraid there must be a mistake," she said, her voice even and calm. "This seat was assigned to me." "There is a mistake," Thorne snarled, turning his fury on the flight attendant, who had scurried over. "And you're going to fix it. Get her out of here. Move her. I don't care where. Put her in the galley. Put her in coach. Just get her out of my sightline." Chloe looked as if she were about to burst into tears. "Mr. Thorne, I can't. The flight is completely full. Every seat is occupied. Dr. Hayes has a valid ticket." Thorne's eyes narrowed, seizing on the name. "Doctor? A doctor of what? Basket weaving?" He leaned down, invading Imani's personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee and self-importance. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't know what little game you're playing. Maybe you flirted with the gate agent. Maybe you played some sort of card. But I own this airline. The plane, the seats, the air you're breathing, it's all mine. Now be a good girl and move." The cabin had gone utterly silent. A man in 3C slowly lowered his Wall Street Journal. Across the aisle, a woman froze with a champagne flute halfway to her lips. This was no longer a simple seating dispute. It was a public execution of dignity. Imani did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. Her heart rate, she noted with detached professionalism, remained a steady 62 beats per minute. "Sir," she said, her voice acquiring a new edge, hard and precise as a diamond cutter, "you are the owner of this airline. That means you are ultimately responsible for Federal Aviation Administration Regulation 121.580, which prohibits any person from assaulting, threatening, intimidating, or interfering with a crew member in the performance of the crew member's duties aboard an aircraft. You are currently intimidating this young woman. I suggest you take your assigned seat before you commit a federal offense." Thorne blinked. He was momentarily thrown off by her vocabulary, by the calm citation of federal code. But his arrogance, a muscle exercised daily for decades, quickly reasserted itself. He let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, a lawyer, even better. You think you can scare me with some cheap legal jargon? I have 100 lawyers on retainer who could buy and sell you before breakfast." He slammed his hand down on the armrest of her seat, the impact jarring her. "I am not intimidating anyone. I am a customer demanding the service I paid for. I pay her salary. I pay your salary in a roundabout way with the taxes my companies generate. Now for the last time, move." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for final cross-check and departure." Thorne's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. The pressure was mounting. His deal was on the line. He saw Imani not as a person, but as a final infuriating obstacle. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a wallet thick with cash. He peeled off 5 $100 bills and threw them onto her lap, where they scattered across the schematic on her tablet. "There," he spat, his voice dripping with venom, $500. That should be more than enough for you. Go buy yourself something nice when we land. Now get out of my seat before I have you thrown off this plane for being a disruptive passenger." The $500 lay on her lap like a declaration of war. The insult was so profound, so utterly dismissive of her humanity, that the air in the cabin seemed to crackle. Chloe, the flight attendant, looked at Imani with wide, terrified eyes, silently pleading for her to just give in, to make the problem go away. Imani looked down at the crisp bills, then she looked back up at Sterling Thorne. A slow, cold smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile a structural engineer gives right before declaring a building condemned. "You're right," she said softly, her voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "You are the owner, and you are responsible." She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. For a moment, Thorne's face relaxed into a triumphant smirk. He thought he had won. He thought his money had, as always, purchased reality. Imani did not move toward the back of the plane. Instead, she turned to face the cockpit door. She raised her voice, not shouting, but projecting with the clear, unwavering authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in rooms full of powerful people. "Captain," she called out, her voice ringing with clarity, "this is Dr. Imani Hayes. I am formally declaring a potential safety hazard in the cabin. I am requesting you halt departure procedures and come to the forward galley immediately." Thorne's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "You're what? Who the hell do you think you are calling the captain?" The cockpit door swung open almost instantly. Captain Frank Miller emerged, a man in his early 60s with weary eyes and the quiet competence of a pilot who had seen it all. He was 2 years from retirement, and his primary goal on any given flight was to get from point A to point B with the minimum amount of drama. A disturbance in first class was a headache he did not need. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Thorne's furious face, the money on the seat, the terrified flight attendant, and the calm, commanding presence of the woman standing by seat 1A. Thorne immediately seized the offensive. "Captain, thank God. This woman is hysterical. She's refusing to move from a seat I require for business. She's making baseless accusations, and now she's trying to delay the flight. I am Sterling Thorne. I own this airline. I need you to remove her." "Now." Captain Miller's eyes narrowed. He looked at Thorne, a man he recognized from fawning corporate memos. Then he looked at Imani. He didn't recognize her. He saw a passenger, albeit a poised one, who was causing a problem for the man who signed his paychecks. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. He was tired of these battles. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion, "Mr. Thorne is the owner of Ascend Air. If we could just find a way to accommodate—" "Captain Miller," Imani interrupted, reading his name tag. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Accommodation is not possible when federal law is being violated. But that is no longer my primary concern." She took a step toward him, lowering her voice slightly, but her intensity made it feel like a shout. "During taxi, I noted a harmonic tremor in the undercarriage, consistent with a pressure variance in the port-side hydraulic system. Given Ascend Air's recent shift in maintenance protocols, which I have been reviewing this morning, I have reason to believe this aircraft, tail number N734AA, may not be in compliance with mandatory airworthiness directives." Captain Miller froze. His weary expression evaporated, replaced by one of sharp professional shock. A regular passenger wouldn't know what a harmonic tremor was. They wouldn't know the term airworthiness directive, and they certainly wouldn't know the tail number of the plane they were on. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Thorne scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "What is this nonsense? She's making things up to cause trouble. Hydraulic this, maintenance that. Captain, are you really going to listen to this amateur?" Imani ignored him, her eyes locked on the captain. "Ask your co-pilot to check the maintenance logs logged this morning for Flight 305. Specifically, check the sign-off for the hydraulic fluid pressure check. I suspect you'll find the signature of a mechanic who was simultaneously listed as working on another aircraft at the opposite end of the airport. It's a common corner-cutting tactic in fleets where maintenance staff are stretched too thin." Captain Miller's face went pale. He had noticed the tremor himself, but had dismissed it as a quirk of the old runway tarmac. But what she described, the falsified logs, the overworked mechanics, it was a scenario that pilots dreaded, a ghost that haunted the quiet moments of every flight. It was the kind of detail that appeared in NTSB reports after a crash. Who are you?" the captain whispered, the question filled with a dawning sense of awe and terror. Imani reached into her briefcase and pulled out a simple government-issue credential. She didn't flash it at Thorne, she presented it quietly, respectfully to Captain Miller. He took the small leather folder. He read the words under the official seal. "Dr. Imani Hayes, Chairwoman, National Transportation Safety Board." The blood drained from Captain Miller's face. He looked from the ID to Imani, then to Sterling Thorne, who was still puffing out his chest, oblivious. The captain's expression was one of pure, unadulterated horror. He wasn't looking at a difficult passenger and his boss. He was looking at a ticking time bomb and the one person on Earth with the authority to defuse it. "Mr. Thorne," Captain Miller said, his voice a choked rasp, "you need to stop talking, right now." "Excuse me?" Thorne blustered. "Did you not hear me? I own this company. I will have your job for this insubordination, Miller." "Sir," the captain said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "The woman you just threw money at, the woman you called sweetheart, is Dr. Imani Hayes. She is the chairwoman of the NTSB. She doesn't just have the authority to ground this plane. She has the authority to put your entire airline out of business, forever." The silence that descended upon the cabin was absolute. It was heavier than gravity, a crushing weight of realization. Sterling Thorne's jaw went slack. His brain, a finely tuned machine for calculating profit and loss, struggled to process this new, catastrophic variable. He looked at Imani, at her simple suit, her calm eyes, her dark skin. The data did not compute. The world as he knew it, a world neatly ordered by wealth and privilege, had just been turned upside down. That's impossible," he stammered, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "Her. She can't be. It's a trick. A lie." Imani took her credential back from the captain's nerveless fingers. She turned to Thorne, her expression no longer curious, but cold as the stratosphere. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and lethal. "It was a field test, and your airline has failed, spectacularly." She then turned to the captain. "Captain Miller, pursuant to my authority under 49 U.S. Code, paragraph L1132, I am ordering this aircraft back to the gate. I am grounding this plane pending a full NTSB safety and maintenance audit. And I want this man arrested for interference with a federal investigation." "Investigation?" Thorne squeaked, his voice cracking. "What investigation?" Imani finally bent down and picked up the 5 $100 bills from her seat. She held them out, not to him, but to the captain. "The investigation," she said, her eyes boring into Thorne's, "into your attempt to bribe a federal official." From the back of the first-class cabin, the distinct, sharp click of a phone's camera shutter could be heard, followed by another, and then another. Sterling Thorne's world wasn't just collapsing, it was being documented, recorded, and uploaded for the entire world to see. The atmosphere inside Flight 305 had transformed from a stage for petty tyranny into the scene of a federal action. The other passengers, once passive spectators, were now wide-eyed witnesses to a power dynamic they had never imagined. The man in 3C had his phone out, discreetly recording. The woman across the aisle was texting furiously. Sterling Thorne, who had built his empire on hostile takeovers and media manipulation, was now the unwilling star of a viral video in the making. "Now hold on a minute," Thorne sputtered, trying to regain his footing. The color had drained from his face, leaving his expensive tan looking like a cheap, sallow mask. "Let's not be hasty. Arrested? That's absurd. It was a tip, a gesture of goodwill to resolve a minor conflict." Imani looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You called it a payment for me to go buy something nice. You threw it on my lap after I refused to relinquish a seat I had lawfully purchased. In the context of your ongoing interference with a crew member, that is not a tip, Mr. Thorne. That is a crime." She turned to Captain Miller, who was still standing ramrod straight, looking as if he'd just seen a ghost. "Captain, please inform the tower that we are returning to the gate and will require Port Authority officers to meet the aircraft." "And the FBI?" "The FBI." Thorne's voice was a strangled whisper. The mention of that particular three-letter agency seemed to finally penetrate his thick skull of entitlement. This had spun far beyond a complaint to customer service. Attempted bribery of a senior executive service-level federal official is their jurisdiction, Imani stated calmly, as if reciting from a textbook. She then looked past him, down the aisle. "Chloe?" The young flight attendant, who had been hiding near the galley, jumped. "Yes, ma'am, Dr. Hayes?" "Please take this money," Imani said, holding out the $500. "Log it with the captain as evidence, and make a detailed report of everything Mr. Thorne said to you and to me. Be precise. Your statement will be crucial." Chloe nodded, her fear now replaced by a dawning sense of empowerment. She took the bills from Imani's hand as if they were radioactive, her fingers brushing against the chairwoman's. It was a small transfer of power, but a significant one. Thorne, desperate, tried a different tactic. He attempted to project an aura of reasonableness, the kind he used in boardrooms to placate angry investors. "Look, Doctor," he said, forcing a sycophantic smile. "Clearly, I've made a terrible mistake. I was under a lot of pressure, big deal on the line. I'm not myself when my blood sugar is low. I apologize. Profusely. There's no need to involve law enforcement. We can handle this professionally. A misunderstanding between two equals." Equals? Imani's voice was dangerously quiet. "A moment ago, you suggested I was a diversity hire who had flirted her way into a better seat. You referred to my work as a hobby. You threw cash at me as if I were a valet. We are not and have never been equals, Mr. Thorne. You are a man who believes rules are for other people. I am the person who writes the reports when men like you get people killed." The plane began a slow, ponderous turn on the tarmac, the engines whining as it headed back toward the terminal. Each degree of the turn felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of Sterling Thorne's life. "You can't do this," he snarled, his composure finally shattering completely. He took a menacing step toward her. "I'll ruin you. I have friends in the Senate. I'll have you investigated. I'll have your funding cut. You'll be back to checking tire pressures at a bus station by the time I'm done with you." Before he could take another step, Captain Miller moved with surprising speed. He put a firm hand on Thorne's chest, holding him back. "That's enough, Thorne. You're done." The use of his last name, stripped of any honorific, was a final, brutal demotion. As the jet bridge reconnected to the aircraft, with a solid, final-sounding thud, the cabin door was opened by the ground crew. Standing there were not smiling gate agents, but two stone-faced Port Authority police officers and a woman in a severe black suit. The woman in the suit stepped aboard, her eyes scanning the cabin before landing on Imani. "Dr. Hayes, Special Agent Durant, we received the captain's call. Is this the individual?" "He is, Agent Durant," Imani confirmed. The agent turned her cold, professional gaze on Thorne. "Sterling Thorne, you are under arrest." The two officers moved in, swift and efficient. Thorne, in a last pathetic act of defiance, tried to pull his arm away. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am?" One of the officers twisted his arm behind his back with practiced ease, eliciting a yelp of pain from the businessman. "Right now, sir, you're a man interfering with a federal officer, and you have the right to remain silent." As they cuffed him, the metallic ratchet clicks echoed in the silent cabin. They were the driest, most definitive sounds Thorne had ever heard. He was no longer a CEO, a titan, a master of the universe. He was just a suspect in a cheap, rumpled suit. They began to lead him off the plane. As he was frog-marched past the other first-class passengers, his eyes, wild and desperate, scanned their faces. He saw no sympathy. He saw only disgust, fascination, and the glowing blue screens of their phones, all pointed at him. He had spent a lifetime curating his public image, paying millions to public relations firms to paint him as a visionary. That image was now being incinerated in a global firestorm of social media posts, all hashtagged Yachash Ascender Fail and Dadcha CEO behaving badly. As he was pulled through the doorway, he turned his head for one last look at Imani. She hadn't watched his arrest. She had already sat back down in seat 1A and was once again focused on her tablet, stylus in hand, as if he were nothing more than a minor, momentary distraction that had already been dealt with. The ultimate dismissal. He wasn't even the most important thing happening in her world. The door to the aircraft hissed shut, leaving behind a cabin thick with the aftershock of the confrontation. The tension slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a murmur of excited, disbelieving chatter. Captain Miller walked slowly back to the front, looking emotionally and physically drained. He stopped beside Imani's seat. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice hoarse. "On behalf of the flight crew, on behalf of every pilot who has ever been pressured to cut a corner by a man in a suit, thank you." He hesitated, then added, "That tremor. I felt it. But I wrote it off. I almost—" He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. He had almost made the wrong choice, the easy choice. Complacency is the first step toward disaster, Captain, Imani said, her eyes finally lifting from her tablet. They were not cold now. They were weary, but filled with a profound sense of purpose. It's my job to fight it. It's your job too. Yes, ma'am, he said, the words full of a newfound respect. The ground crew is waiting for your orders. What do you want to do with the aircraft? I want a full Level C maintenance check, strip the landing gear assembly, run a full diagnostic on the hydraulics. I want to see the maintenance logs for this plane for the last 6 months, and I want the FAA to cross-reference them with the mechanics' timesheets. No one flies on this plane until my team clears it. And the passengers? He asked, gesturing to the full cabin. Get them rebooked on other carriers at Ascendair's expense, she said, and give them all a full refund and a voucher for their trouble. I imagine Mr. Thorne's corporate card has a high enough limit. A faint, wry smile touched her lips for the first time. An announcement was made. The flight was cancelled due to unforeseen maintenance requirements. A collective groan went through the cabin, but it was quickly replaced by buzzing excitement as the story of what had happened in first class spread like wildfire. As the passengers began to deplane, many of them walked past seat 1A with a new sense of reverence, nodding respectfully at the woman who sat there, calmly dismantling an empire. An hour later, the plane was empty, save for Imani, Captain Miller, and a team of FAA and NTSB investigators who had been scrambled to the scene. The cabin, once a theatre of drama, was now a crime scene. Imani stood on the tarmac under the massive wing of the 737, the drizzle having subsided. An NTSB lead investigator, a grizzled veteran named Ben Carter, held up a tablet showing a preliminary report. You were right, Chairwoman, Ben said, pointing to a graph on the screen. The pressure readings from the portside hydraulic accumulator were fluctuating well outside of tolerance. It would have held for a while, but a hard landing. Wind shear on approach. It's a roll of the dice. You probably saved 150 lives today. Imani just nodded, her gaze fixed on the massive landing gear assembly where mechanics were now swarming. She felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction. This wasn't about punishing Sterling Thorne for his arrogance. It was about the system. It was always about the system. Thorne's behavior was just a symptom of a deeper disease. A corporate culture that valued profit over people. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her chief of staff. Video has 10 million views. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all running. The message from her chief of staff glowed on the screen, each word a seismic shockwave radiating outward from the incident on the plane. You didn't just ground a plane, boss. You may have just sunk a corporation. Imani switched the phone off and slipped it back into her pocket. The cool metal felt heavy, like a stone. Ben Carter, her lead investigator, was still talking beside her, pointing at pressure variance charts on his tablet, but his voice seemed to come from a great distance. Her focus was on the machine in front of them. The Boeing 737, tail number N734AA, sat under the harsh glare of the tarmac floodlights, looking like a beached whale. It was no longer an elegant vessel of transport, it was an artifact, a crime scene. Mechanics and investigators in bright yellow vests swarmed around it, their movements precise and urgent. She felt the weight of the moment settle not as triumph, but as a vast and chilling responsibility. The viral videos, the presidential praise, the impending media storm, all of it was noise. The signal, the only thing that mattered, was the silent, terrifying truth of the numbers on Ben's tablet. The hydraulic pressure fluctuations, the microscopic stress fractures on the actuator casing, invisible to a hurried eye but screamingly obvious to a forensic metallurgist. It was the grammar of disaster, a language she had spent her entire life learning to read. Get me the full maintenance and supply chain records for Ascend's entire 737 fleet, she said to Ben, her voice cutting through the tarmac hum. I want to know where every single bolt, every O-ring, every drop of hydraulic fluid came from for the last 24 months. Cross-reference mechanic timesheets with security gate logs. I don't want to know what the paperwork says. I want to know who was physically present when they claimed to have signed off on a repair. Ben nodded, his weary eyes alight with the grim thrill of the hunt. You think this is fleet-wide? It wasn't a question. Men like Thorne don't cut corners in just one place, Imani replied, her gaze still fixed on the aircraft. They build a business model on it. This plane isn't the disease, it's the first observable symptom. The next few weeks were a blur of sealed depositions, encrypted data transfers, and the endless grinding work of piecing together a conspiracy of negligence. Imani's Washington office became the war room. Whiteboards were covered in complex diagrams connecting shell corporations to unauthorized parts suppliers in Shenzhen. The coffee machine ran non-stop. Imani herself seemed to subsist on pure intellectual stamina, often found at 3 in the morning, poring over metallurgical reports, her mind connecting a faulty batch of titanium alloy to a cost-cutting directive Thorne had issued a year prior. Sterling Thorne had lawyered up, surrounding himself with a team of belligerent, high-priced attorneys who specialized in corporate warfare. Their strategy was clear: attack the messenger. They filed motions to have Imani recused, claiming personal animus. They leaked fabricated stories to friendly media outlets, painting her as an overzealous, politically motivated regulator on a witch hunt. The real battle, Imani knew, wouldn't be fought in the press. It would be fought in the quiet, sterile rooms where evidence was presented. She attended the deposition of Thorne's chief operating officer, a man named Marcus Peterson, who had cultivated the same air of sleek, untouchable arrogance as his boss. Peterson sat across the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 lawyers, looking bored. He answered the FBI's questions with practiced ease, explaining that Ascend Air had a robust and industry-leading safety culture, and that the incident on Flight 305 was an unfortunate but isolated mechanical anomaly. Imani had remained silent for 2 hours, just listening, her hands steepled in front of her. Finally, the lead FBI agent turned to her. "Dr. Hayes, do you have any questions for Mr. Peterson?" Imani leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice soft but carrying an unnerving precision. "On April 14th of this year, you signed purchase order 77B14 for a shipment of 200 hydraulic actuators from a company called Aero Solutions Global. Is that correct?" Peterson glanced at his lawyer, who gave a slight nod. "I sign hundreds of purchase orders. The name sounds familiar." Aero Solutions Global's listed address is a post office box in Macau, Imani continued, her eyes never leaving his. "They have no manufacturing facilities. They are a third-party reseller. The actuators they provided you were reverse-engineered copies of FAA-certified parts, manufactured with a lower-grade T6-6061 aluminum alloy instead of the mandated T6-7075. Are you aware of that?" Peterson's mask of calm slipped. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. "Our procurement department vets all our suppliers." Imani slid a document across the table. It was an internal company email, unearthed from the seized servers. "This is an email from you to Mr. Thorne, dated April 10th. In it, you state, and I quote, 'Sterling, the Macau supplier can deliver the actuators at a 63% cost reduction. Certification is pending, but the risk is statistically negligible. Recommending we proceed to maintain Q2 profitability targets.' Statistically negligible, Mr. Peterson? The alloy you approved has a tensile strength 30% lower than the required standard. Under the repeated stress of takeoffs and landings, catastrophic failure isn't a risk. It's a mathematical certainty. The only question is when." The room was utterly silent. Peterson stared at the email as if it were a snake. His lawyers were shuffling papers, their faces grim. He had walked into a trap of his own making, sprung by a woman who knew more about his business than he did. In that moment, the entire corporate defense crumbled, reduced to a single damning email. Peterson's composure shattered, and with it, the wall of lies Thorne had built around his airline. The political pressure came next, as she knew it would. She was summoned to the office of Senator Alistair Davies, a powerful, silver-haired relic from a state where one of Thorne's other companies was a major employer. His office was a shrine to his own ego, filled with dark wood, leather-bound books, and photos of him with presidents. "Imani, may I call you Imani?" he began, his voice a folksy, condescending drawl. "You've done a fine job rattling cages, shaken things up." Point made. But this investigation, it's starting to have a chilling effect on the business community. Good people are losing their jobs over at Ascend. Senator, Imani replied, her voice cool and formal, the only chilling effect I'm concerned with is the one that happens to an aluminum alloy when it's subjected to temperatures of minus 60 degrees at 35,000 feet without the proper tensile strength. Davy's smile tightened. Now, there's no need for that kind of talk. What we have here is a classic case of one bad apple. Sterling Thorne. He was arrogant, he was foolish, and he's going to pay the price. Let the Justice Department handle him. But your NTSB, this fleet-wide audit, this talk of revoking certifications, it's scorched earth. You're punishing the whole orchard for one rotten fruit. Imani opened her briefcase and placed a single thin folder on his vast, empty desk. That folder contains the preliminary findings from our audit of Thorne's regional shipping logistics company, which happens to be the largest employer in your district. It details the systematic falsification of maintenance records for their long-haul trucking fleet. Worn-out tires, faulty brakes, drivers pushed well past their federally mandated hour limits. It's the exact same business model as the airline, Senator. Greed, negligence, and a complete disregard for human life. She leaned forward. You can call this a witch hunt. You can try to cut my funding in the next appropriations bill. But when a 16-wheeler with bad brakes plows through a school bus on an interstate in your home state, this report will be entered into the public record. And I will be obliged to testify that your office was made aware of the systemic risks months in advance and chose to pressure me to look the other way. So you have a choice. You can protect one bad apple, or you can protect the children who ride those school buses. Senator Davies stared at the folder, his face ashen. He had come expecting to intimidate a bureaucrat. He found himself facing a woman who had already calculated every possible move and had checkmated him before he'd even sat down. He slowly slid the folder back across the desk. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Dr. Hayes, he said, his voice now stripped of all its false warmth. I trust you will continue to do your job with the utmost diligence. The final act before the trial was Thorne's own deposition. He entered the room, looking diminished. The bespoke suits now hung loosely on his frame, and the confident stride had been replaced by a weary shuffle. But as he sat down, Imani saw a glimmer of the old arrogance in his eyes. He still believed, on some fundamental level, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be cleared up if people would just listen to him. His lawyers had coached him to be contrite, but his narcissism was a current too strong to resist. He repeatedly tried to frame the incident on the plane as a personal conflict, a clash of personalities. Dr. Hayes was aggressive, he said, looking at the assembled lawyers. She seemed to have a chip on her shoulder from the moment I approached. I felt she was deliberately trying to provoke a confrontation. Imani listened patiently. When it was her turn, she ignored the personal drama entirely. She projected a series of documents onto the screen at the front of the room. Shipping manifests, bank statements, corporate charters. Mr. Thorne, let's talk about a company called Viridian Parts Sourcing, she said. It's a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. You are its sole director. On May 3rd, Viridian purchased 4,000 counterfeit landing gear bolts from an uncertified factory in Guangzhou for 87 cents apiece. 2 weeks later, Viridian sold those same bolts to Ascend Air's procurement department for $42 apiece, a profit of over 4,700%. Those bolts, Mr. Thorne, were installed on 74 of your aircraft. Our analysis shows they have a sheer strength less than half of the FAA requirement. Can you explain that transaction? Thorne stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. That's a complex financial arrangement. It's about asset allocation, not— Is it? Imani interrupted, her voice like ice. Or is it about you personally, profiting from knowingly putting defective, life-threatening parts on your own passenger planes? Planes carrying men, women, and children. She clicked to the next slide. It was a photograph of one of the counterfeit bolts, a hairline crack visible under microscopic magnification. This crack is a death sentence, Mr. Thorne, waiting for the right combination of runway conditions and landing weight to fail. You didn't just endanger your passengers, you sold them the bullet and put it in the gun yourself. He finally broke. The blustering, the arrogance, the carefully constructed facade of a business titan, it all dissolved into the pathetic, sputtering rage of a man confronted with the irrefutable, ugly truth of his own greed. He lunged to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You did this. This is all your fault. You set me up." His lawyers had to physically restrain him. And in that moment, everyone in the room saw him for what he was. Not a king, but a common criminal. A year to the day after the confrontation on Flight 305, Imani sat in the back row of a federal courtroom. She wore a simple grey dress and no makeup, an anonymous face in the public gallery. Sterling Thorne, looking frail and spectral in an ill-fitting suit, stood before the judge for sentencing. He read a hollow, prepared statement about regret. The judge's voice was like the crack of a gavel. "Mr. Thorne," he said, looking down from the bench, "your crime was not merely fraud. It was a profound betrayal of the public trust. You operated under the delusion that wealth was a shield against consequence. But there is a higher authority than the balance sheet. It is the physics that keeps a plane in the air, and it is the law that holds men like you accountable. The woman you tried to buy for $500 represented that law. She represented the barrier of fact and integrity that you thought you could simply push aside. You were wrong." The sentence was 15 years. As the U.S. Marshals led him away, his eyes, vacant and defeated, swept across the gallery. For a fleeting second they met Imani's. There was no recognition. To him she was just another stranger watching his final public humiliation. He had never truly seen her at all. Imani felt no joy, no sense of victory. Only the quiet, somber weight of a necessary duty performed. She slipped out of the courtroom before the press scrum could form. The system had worked. The case was closed. For her, it was already time to focus on the next potential disaster waiting in the wings. 2 years later, Imani was on a flight from Chicago to Seattle, wedged into a middle seat in coach. The cabin was warm, the lights were dim. She was reading a dense NTSB report on fatigue in railway switching systems, the pages filled with engineering diagrams and metal stress analysis. It was her life's work, and she was content. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile, stopped her cart by Imani's row. "Anything to drink, ma'am?" "Just a ginger ale, please," Imani said, looking up from her report. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, paused as she handed over the can. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're Dr. Hayes, aren't you?" Imani managed a small smile. "I am." Tears instantly welled in Sarah's eyes, and she clutched a hand to her chest. "Oh my goodness. I've wanted to meet you for 2 years." She leaned in closer, her voice thick with emotion. "My son, Kevin, he's a mechanic. With this airline. Before everything you did, he was going to quit. The pressure to sign off on things he wasn't sure about, to rush jobs. It was eating him alive. He was afraid he'd make a mistake. He was afraid of losing his job if he spoke up." She took a shaky breath. After the Thorne Act passed, everything changed. It was like a light came on. Last month, Kevin found a microfracture in a turbine blade during a pre-flight check. A year ago, he might have been told to ignore it to avoid a delay. This time, his supervisor thanked him, grounded the plane, and gave him a commendation. He came home that night and he told me, "Mom, I feel like I can finally do my job right. I can keep people safe." The tears were now streaming freely down her face. "You didn't just change the laws, Dr. Hayes. You gave people like my son their dignity back. You have no idea. You saved him. You saved us." The raw, unexpected humanity of the moment hit Imani with a force no Senate hearing or legal battle ever had. All she could do was nod, a lump forming in her throat. "Your son is the hero, Sarah," she managed to say. "He did the work. He did the work because you made it safe for him to do so," she whispered, squeezing Imani's shoulder gently before composing herself and moving on with her cart. Imani leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. The drone of the engines, a sound she so often passed for tremors and inconsistencies, now filled her ears as a steady, reassuring hum. It was the sound of 1,000 interconnected parts working in harmony. The sound of a mechanic's careful hand, a pilot's steady gaze, a flight attendant's watchful eye. It was the sound of a system, a fragile, complex, and deeply human system that she had fought to protect. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't listening for the flaw. She was just listening to the flight, the quiet lullaby of a promise being kept, soaring through the vast and quiet dark.